Welcome to Flash News. Zelensky hails fresh aid money from U.S. Ukraine's President Zelensky has tweeted his gratitude after his American counterpart Joe Biden signed off $40 billion of fresh aid money for Ukraine. The aid package was overwhelmingly approved by the U.S. Senate on Thursday. The money represents the largest package of U.S. aid since Russia invaded. It includes $6 billion for security assistance, including training, equipment, weapons, and support, $9 billion for an economic support fund for Ukraine, $5 billion to address global food insecurity. Diplomacy looks likeliest path for Ukraine right now. The most likely outcome in Ukraine looks to be a return to diplomacy, something President Zelensky hinted at in his interview earlier. The alternatives are a change of heart in Russia, or even a change of leadership there, which seem far less likely. Zelensky has made it clear that he doesn't have the means to push the Russians back, which is why he's urging people to stay cautious about the eventual outcome. But we've not had any signs of the Ukrainian resistance easing in any way. So I think any resolution is going to rely on a peace deal at this moment in time. The Donbass in the east is still Russia's priority. We're hearing from Ukrainian forces that Moscow is throwing everything at the region, possibly because its troops can move more freely now that the Ukrainian city of Mariupol has fallen. What's been happening in Ukraine? Hello and welcome along to our live coverage of the war in Ukraine. Here's a quick summary of today's main news. President Zelensky says the war in Ukraine can only be resolved through diplomacy. Speaking on Ukrainian television, he suggested his country could be victorious on the battlefield, but that things could only come to a conclusive halt at the negotiating table. America's President Biden has signed a bill to provide another $40 billion of military, economic, and humanitarian aid for Ukraine, the largest aid package since Russia began its war. Russia now claims to be in full control of Mariupol after the final defenders of the Azovstal metal works surrendered. Russia also says its military had destroyed a major consignment of Western arms in Ukraine's Hytomyr region, west of Kiev. The UK's Foreign Secretary says Moldova's defenses should be brought up to the standard of the NATO military alliance, over concerns that Moscow could launch an attack there. Russia has switched off its gas supply to Finland after the country refused Moscow's demand to pay for fuel in Russian rubles. Ukraine has broken the backbone of Russian army. Zelensky. More now from President Zelensky, who's been speaking on Ukrainian TV. He said his country had broken the backbone of one of the world's strongest armies, adding that the Russians were not going to regain their feet in the next several years. But he cautioned against high expectations about what Ukraine could achieve on the battlefield. Zelensky said returning to the status quo of February 23, before Russia invaded, would represent victory. This would mean an end to the war's first stage, he said, adding the conflict could only be fully resolved through diplomacy. Zelensky insisted his country was adequately prepared for the invasion, and suggests the Russians made underestimations. They did not know about a number of things, he claimed. The president was speaking in a 75-minute pre-recorded interview alongside his wife, Olena Zelenska. The broadcast was to mark 3 years since he took office. Biden signs $40 billion aid bill for Ukraine's war effort. President Biden has signed a bill that confirms $40 billion of new aid for Ukraine's war effort, the White House says. The money represents the largest package of American assistance since Russia launched its invasion in February. The bill, which will funnel support to Ukraine for about the next 5 months, includes around $6 billion budgeted for armored vehicles and air defenses. Biden is currently in South Korea, during a 4-day trip through Asia. Speaking in Seoul, he said Russia's invasion of Ukraine was an attack on core international principles. Where else has Russia halted gas supplies? Not just Finland that will no longer receive natural gas from Russia. Last month, the Russian state-owned energy company Gazprom cut off supplies to Poland and Bulgaria after they, like Finland, refused to make payments in the Russian currency rubles. All three countries are members of the EU, which has insisted payments continue to be made in euros, and many other members are set to face the same issue when payments are due. The demand by Russia is an attempt to shore up the Russian currency and benefit its economy in response to Western sanctions. Brussels has said it considers Russia's action to be a form of blackmail. Ukrainian defenses creaking in the Donbass. What we're hearing from Ukrainian troops fighting in the Donbass region is that the Russians have moved forward. In fact, official communiques have said the same thing. It's a matter of miles. It's not like there's been a major breakthrough and Russian troops are pouring through. But I think the Ukrainian defenses are creaking. They haven't broken, but they've had to retreat. They've blown up bridges to try and slow down the Russian advance. Luhansk, which is the northeastern part of the Donbass region, is the area they are really prioritizing. And this morning what we heard from people there on the military side was that the Russians were doing more airstrikes, more shelling, and were really ramping up the firepower to break those Ukrainian defenses. Yesterday, the Russian defense minister said Luhansk would soon be 100% in their hands. Mariupol capture frees Russian troops for fighting elsewhere. Russian forces are intensifying their battle to capture more territory in the eastern Donbass region, where they've been heavily bombarding Ukrainian positions. Moscow now claims to have fully captured the strategic port city of Mariupol, where Ukrainian troops had been fighting for weeks to defend a huge steel plant. Those fighters have all surrendered. The freeing up of Russian forces from Mariupol has raised concerns in Kiev that Moscow will now be able to encircle the east of Ukraine. The authorities in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions say at least 9 more Ukrainian civilians were killed in Russian attacks on Friday. Russia claims to have destroyed shipment of Western weapons. Russia says it's destroyed a large shipment of weapons sent by Western countries to help Ukraine. It was blown up near a railway station in the northern Zhytomyr region, west of Kiev, using missiles launched from the sea, the Russian Defense Ministry is quoted as saying by the Interfax news agency. The ministry said the weapons were intended for Ukrainian forces in the eastern Donbass region. Among other updates, Russia also reportedly claimed to have attacked a training base for Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, as well as fuel storage facilities near the southern port city of Odessa. It was not possible for the BBC to independently verify the claims made. 9.Zelensky says only diplomacy can end Ukraine war. The war in Ukraine can only be resolved through diplomacy, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said, despite a current deadlock in negotiations between the two sides. Speaking on Ukrainian television, he suggested his country could be victorious on the battlefield, but that things could only come to a conclusive halt at the negotiating table. The conflict will be bloody, there will be fighting, but it will only definitively end through diplomacy, Zelensky said. But he indicated this would not be easy as neither side wanted to give anything up. On Tuesday, Kiev's lead negotiator Mikhailo Podolyak said talks were on hold. The following day, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov accused Kiev authorities of not wanting to continue talks to end hostilities. Russian news agencies say the last meeting happened nearly a month ago, on April 22. How many Azovstal fighters have surrendered and what will happen to them? Russia has declared victory at Mariupol's Azovstal steelworks, after weeks of near-constant bombardment amid incredible Ukrainian resistance. But many questions remain. First, the exact number of fighters who have surrendered, and are now in Russian-controlled territory, is still not clear. Russia claims more than 2,000 are now in their hands, a number that hasn't been confirmed by Ukraine. The Red Cross says it's registered hundreds of prisoners of war, but the difference could be explained by delays in the process. Then, what will happen to them? Ukrainian authorities have suggested they will be exchanged with Russian prisoners of war, something Moscow hasn't confirmed. And there's already opposition in Russia to that. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank, says Russian officials might try to inflate the numbers of soldiers captured in order to maximize the number of Russian prisoners that can be exchanged if a prisoner swap is agreed. Perhaps as important, They say that Russian leadership may also seek to avoid the embarrassment of admitting that their forces have been locked in a months-long siege by hundreds rather than thousands of Ukrainian defenders. Russia declares complete victory in Mariupol. Russia has declared victory in its months-long battle to conquer the Ukrainian port city of Mariupol. The last fighters defending the city's Azovstal steel plant have now surrendered, Moscow officials said. For months the troops had been holed up in the huge complex, preventing Russia from establishing complete control over the city. Friday's evacuation marks the end of the most destructive siege of the war, with Mariupol now in complete ruins. The city and its steel plant are now completely liberated, after 531 Ukrainian troops left the site, the Russian Defense Ministry said. The underground facilities of the enterprise, where the militants were hiding, came under the full control of the Russian armed forces, it added in a statement. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the site's last remaining defenders had been given permission to leave. Today the boys received a clear signal from the military command that they can get out and save their lives, he told a Ukrainian television channel earlier on Friday. For weeks the Azovstal site had been completely encircled. Russian forces blocked all humanitarian aid from entering, bombarded the site from the air and demanded its remaining defenders put down their weapons. Many of those trapped inside were civilians, including women, children, and elderly people. Earlier this month they were completely evacuated following painstaking negotiations coordinated by the UN and Red Cross that lasted for weeks. But the continued refusal of the site's Ukrainian defenders to surrender meant Russia was unable to command complete control over the strategic port city. For many Ukrainians, it also turned the Azovstal defenders into national heroes who symbolized the country's stubborn resistance. The hundreds of soldiers holed up inside included Marines, the National Guard, border guards, police, and territorial defense units. Camped out with diminishing food supplies and no water, they lived for weeks in underground bunkers and tunnels without seeing daylight. The sprawling 4-square-mile complex is a maze of tunnels designed to survive a nuclear war. Their commander said all wounded troops had now been taken away by Russian buses and ambulances. Fate of Ukrainian defenders. According to Moscow officials, today's evacuation means a total of 2,439 Ukrainian fighters have now surrendered from the steel works in recent days. Moscow has released no information about where the soldiers who left today are being evacuated to, but previous buses have been sent to Russian-controlled territories. A video released by the Russian Defense Ministry, which the BBC has been unable to verify, appears to show a line of unarmed men approaching Russian soldiers outside the plant and giving their names. The Russians then carefully search each man and their possessions. Ukrainian officials hope they can be released as part of a prisoner exchange, but that has not been confirmed by Moscow. Russian President Vladimir Putin said the soldiers would be treated in line with the relevant international laws, but there is concern over what will happen to them if they remain in Russian custody. However, on Tuesday Russian lawmakers put forward plans to declare Azov regiment fighters Nazi criminals, who must not be part of any prisoner swap with Ukraine. The Azov regiment, set up as a volunteer militia in 2014 but now a National Guard unit, once had links to the far right. Meanwhile, the Office of Russia's Prosecutor General has asked the country's Supreme Court to declare the unit a terrorist organization, in an apparent attempt to prevent its fighters being treated as conventional prisoners of war. Moldova should be armed to NATO standards. Trust Moldova should be equipped to NATO standard, to help it guard against the threat of a Russian invasion, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has said. Ms. Truss told The Telegraph that talks were underway with allies about how to help smaller nations defend themselves. She said it was clear that, despite limited success in Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin retained ambitions to create a greater Russia. Moldova, once a Soviet republic, sits on Ukraine's southwestern border. It does not share a border with Russia, but is close to some of the regions currently occupied by Russian forces in Ukraine's south. Moldova is not a member of NATO, although it did apply to join the European Union less than 2 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine. Ms. Truss said that discussions about upgrading Ukrainian defenses to deter future aggression would also cover other vulnerable states such as Moldova. "I would want to see Moldova equipped to NATO standard," she said. "This is a discussion we're having with our allies." Asked whether that was because Russia was thought to pose a security threat to Moldova, she said, "Absolutely. I mean, Putin has been clear about his ambitions to create a greater Russia. And just because his attempts to take Kiev weren't successful, doesn't mean he's abandoned those ambitions." Moldova, one of Europe's poorest countries, is home to many ethnic Ukrainians and has taken in more than 437,000 refugees from the war. In a country of 2.6 million people that is higher than any other for the size of its population. Moldova's President Maya Sandu is strongly pro-EU, but her predecessor Igor Dodon, who still has many supporters, was pro-Russian. Russia supports separatists who control a breakaway region called Transnistria and has around 1,500 troops there. In late April, the Transnistrian Authority said that explosions had targeted their state security HQ in the main city of Tiraspol, Soviet-era radio masts used to broadcast Russian news, and a military unit in a village outside Tiraspol. Separatist authorities blamed Ukrainian infiltrators, but Kiev said Russian special services were responsible. Dr. Jack Waddling, senior research fellow at defense and security think tank the Royal United Services Institute, told BBC Radio 4's Today program, "There isn't an immediate threat against Moldova from the Russian military, but there is definitely a significant threat from Russian subversive activity and destabilization actions." He said it was sensible to build up appropriate capabilities so Moldova can stand on its own 2 feet, given that Russia has publicly indicated that it has designs on that country. "It is worth doing that while you have the time to do it properly rather than coming to the problem when the threat is very acute," he added. Ms. Truss' comments come just weeks after she said the West must be prepared for the long haul and double down on our support for Ukraine. Speaking in London, she said, "If Putin succeeds, there will be untold further misery across Europe and terrible consequences across the globe. We would never feel safe again." She also called for an increase in the UK's defence spending and said that the NATO target of 2% of GDP should be a floor, not a ceiling. In April, Prime Minister Boris Johnson promised that the UK would provide Ukraine with more military equipment. In a phone conversation with President Volodymyr Zelensky, he pledged that more armored vehicles, drones and anti-tank weapons would be sent. On Friday, the PM also held a call with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in which they discussed recent applications for NATO membership by Sweden and Finland. Turkey has signaled an intention to veto the applications, accusing the countries of not taking a clear stance against Kurdish groups it considers to be terrorists. A Downing Street spokesperson said Mr. Johnson had told Mr. Erdogan that Finland and Sweden would be valuable additions to the NATO alliance, and had encouraged him to work with counterparts in both countries to address any concerns ahead of a summit of the military alliance in Madrid in June. Russian assets should be seized to fund rebuilding of Ukraine, says Zelensky. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on Ukraine's allies to sign a multilateral agreement, creating a mechanism to compensate every person who has suffered from the actions of the Russian army. Speaking in his nightly address, Zelensky said Russian funds and property that are located in allied countries should be seized or frozen and then confiscated and directed to a specially created fund from which everyone affected by Russian aggression will be able to receive appropriate compensation. "We are working to ensure that Russia compensates, in one way or another, for everything it has destroyed in Ukraine. Every burned house, every ruined school, ruined hospital, each blown-up house of culture and infrastructure, every enterprise destroyed, every business stopped. Russia will feel the true weight of every missile, every bomb and every missile it has launched across Ukraine." Earlier, German Finance Minister Christian Lindner said seizing Russian assets to help rebuild Ukraine was a possibility, following a G7 summit in Germany. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov previously said the plan to use seized Russian assets to pay for reconstruction in Ukraine would be outright theft. What's the latest in Ukraine? If you're just joining us or need a catch-up, here are the latest developments in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has condemned a missile strike against a cultural center in the Kharkiv region, which injured 7 people including an 11-year-old child, as absolute evil, absolute stupidity. The evacuation of civilians and wounded soldiers from the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol has been completed after Ukrainian soldiers finally ended their defense of the devastated port city after weeks of bombardment. The commander of the Azov regiment said a process was underway to remove the bodies of those who died in the fighting in the steelworks. It remains unclear how many fighters remain in the plant. Russia is to cut its supply of natural gas to Finland after the Nordic country refused to pay for its supplies in rubles. Ukraine has dismissed Russia's plan to connect a giant Ukrainian nuclear power station to the Russian electricity grid after Russia's deputy prime minister vowed to sell power from it to Ukraine. Finance ministers from the G7 group of nations have agreed on a further $9.5 billion of financial aid for Ukraine, bringing their total commitment to almost $20 billion. Pictures show destruction caused by strike on cultural center. More now on that missile strike directed against the newly renovated House of Culture in Lozova, in the Kharkiv region. Images taken by the State Emergency Service of Ukraine show the destruction caused by the strike, which Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky blamed on Russian forces and condemned as absolute evil. Viktor Zabishta, a local health official, told the Interfax Ukraine news agency, "No one has died yet." Russia has routinely been accused of targeting civilian infrastructure since it launched its invasion of Ukraine on February 24. The conflict has devastated several urban centers, with Mariupol in the south suffering near total destruction. Russia has not yet commented on the attack. Azovstal families worried over fighters' fate. The fighters were left with no option. After weeks holed up in Mariupol's Azovstal steelworks, they were ordered to surrender. Hundreds are now in Russian hands. Their fate remains unknown. For their families, it's been an anxious wait. They hope the fighters will return soon in a prisoner swap, as suggested by Ukrainian authorities. But it's not clear when, or if, that will happen. Ksenia, whose husband was at the plant, told me she hadn't received any information about where he was, but that she believed he was among the fighters taken to Russian-controlled territory. There's been no list of who has been evacuated. "We're very concerned because the country has shown that they don't follow the rules," she said, referring to Russia. "We really hope that the task of saving their lives will be completed." Natalia, sister of a fighter, said the only information she had received came from the videos posted by some of the commanders online. "There's been no official information," she said. "We hope there'll be an agreement for their." Russia says the fighters will be treated in line with international norms. And the Red Cross says it has registered hundreds of prisoners of war who surrendered at Azovstal, without giving details. An unknown number of combatants remain inside the plant. What will happen to them is also not clear. Days-long roadblocks, missiles, and lots of blood. Civilians recall terrifying attempts to escape Ukraine cities as Russian forces tighten grip. Lviv, Ukraine. As thousands of Ukrainians continue to flee Russian-occupied parts of southern Ukraine, they run a gauntlet of harassment by Russian troops, sometimes coming under fire. More than a dozen people have spoken to CNN at length about their harrowing journeys out of the Kherson region, which has been under Russian control since the beginning of the invasion in late February. They also tell of the unexplained disappearances at night, the climate of fear and the acute shortages that led them to flee. Ukrainian officials said Friday that the Russians have now blocked exits from Kherson to areas controlled by the Ukrainian government and are trying to send everyone who wants to leave to Crimea. They say the Russians have intensified patrols and increased the number of checkpoints. Several people have been killed and many more injured when their convoys became stranded in what's known as the gray zone between Russian and Ukrainian lines. At least 2 convoys were marooned for days around Davydiv Brid, a village set in rolling farmland where the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhia meet. One column was fired on a week ago, a man was killed and several people injured. This week, at least 3 people were killed and many more injured in the village when a convoy of about 100 civilian vehicles was fired on, according to witnesses. The prosecutor's office in nearby Kryvyi Rih told CNN that gathering evidence was difficult because the area was regularly under fire. The convoy hit this week was actually trying to enter Kherson when it was fired on. People in the convoy told CNN that many were returning to deliver medicines, others to look after family members. Some could not afford higher rents in Ukrainian-controlled areas and had decided to go home. Petro was one of those trying to get into Kherson. He told CNN how people had cowered by a river as shells flew first in one direction, then in the other direction above us. CNN is using only the first names of witnesses to protect them and their families from possible retribution. The next afternoon, on May 17, Petro said the column itself came under fire. "I heard a whistling sound in the sky. We ran to the nearest barn, fell to the ground and started praying. When I came out of the barn, I saw that the explosions had hit a place next to our column. There was worse to come. Another burst of shells landed even more closely. Glass from the buses rained down on me, the buses themselves were slashed," Petro said. When he emerged, Petro found dozens of vehicles damaged, and several bodies. There was a Volkswagen Polo, the car was torn apart. I don't know where the people from that car went. I saw 2 male corpses. Lots of blood, lots of injured people, they were screaming. Petro fled to a Ukrainian checkpoint, where, he said, there were ambulances, a lot of bloodied and bandaged people. Anatoly was also in the convoy. During the first salvo, there were 20 to 30 people at the epicenter of the shelling. Of this number of people, only 5 people remained unharmed, including me, he said. Later, Russian soldiers came to the site and took away 7 of the injured, Anatoly said. He heard the soldiers say they would be taken to a hospital in Nova Kakhovka, about 30 miles away. Several days on the road. While some people are returning to Kherson, many more are trying desperately to leave. Video on Thursday showed a column of hundreds of cars trying to get into Ukrainian-held territory south of Zaporizhia. Ukrainian officials estimated there were 1,000 vehicles at the site by Thursday night. People often spend several days on the road trying to find a safe escape route, negotiating dozens of roadblocks, not always successfully. Daniel, who is 18, eventually did find a way out, along with his girlfriend and their parents. But on their first attempt, he said, the Russians fired at the wheels of the cars leading the convoy and told them to turn back. The convoy included cancer patients in need of treatment, he said. For 8 days in a row, Daniel said, many in the convoy tried to move north and were sent back. And on the 8th day we left the house at 4 a.m. and were the first in the column. And Russians let us go. CNN spoke to Ludmila on Friday. By then her family of 12 were on their 7th day on the road. But they were still far from Ukrainian-controlled territory. She said she knew people had been killed and injured trying to cross the gray zone but added, there is no work in Kherson, our money is running out. We live on the 7th floor and we are afraid that a rocket will hit us. One man told CNN there were 24 Russian checkpoints between Kherson and Melitopol alone. He said he and his family waited 3 days at a checkpoint, sleeping in their car. They ultimately gave up and traveled to another area, where they spent a night at a destroyed gas station before being able to cross near Zaporizhia. Escaping disappearances and shortages. Ukrainian officials estimate that about half the population of Kherson has now left the region. Some are motivated by shortages or lack of work, others by what they see as the oppressive Russian presence. Sergei, who is in his 40s, told CNN that he and his family had decided to leave as a pro-Russian way of life was being introduced. There are special passes they have implemented. If they don't like you, they can take you away, he said. Daniel said he wanted to leave because he and his friends are all designers who had lost their jobs. And we couldn't work. And none of us wanted to live in the occupation. He also said screaming was often heard at night in Kherson. And then it turns out that someone was abducted, killed, and so on. My friend was driving a car at midnight. His car was taken away. He was stripped and beaten. The Russians like to shoot, he said. They have nothing to do, they shoot in the air and find it funny that everyone is hiding. They also like to drive an armored personnel carrier, turn on the spotlight and shine through the windows until people leave the house. Maria is now safe in Ukrainian-held territory, but she recalls recent weeks in Kherson with a shudder. We constantly lived in fear. There are many roadblocks around the city. They check passports and phones, especially for men. She had attended protests in Kherson in March. I went to the rallies, filmed them, posted them on Instagram. Until Russians started shooting. And we stopped going to rallies. The conflict was never far away, Maria said. Lots of explosions. Outside the city there is Chernobivka, where hostilities are constantly going on. The Russians have established a base at Chernobivka, where there is an airfield. It has come under frequent attack by the Ukrainians. Living under terror. Many others think that trying to leave Kherson has become too dangerous. Elena says she and her children set out on May 12th. Twice they got lost. Now, she says, we want to wait. It's scary to drive through the battle zone. But she is desperate to leave. I'm nervous here. People with machine guns are on the streets, explosions are heard the whole day. Citizens here are under terror. We cannot speak to each other. She also said there was no work, those people who had not fled had no money. There were few doctors and a chronic shortage of medicines. Hospitals have run out of drip solutions. Now my father needs an operation, but the hospitals do not have the necessary medicines. Maria also said there was an acute shortage of medicine. Volunteers started trying to deliver drugs to Kherson. One shipment was worth $7,000, and the Russians simply stole this cargo. CNN was unable to confirm that incident but heard other accounts of Russian troops pilfering from aid convoys. Ruslan said he had spent years improving his property. We understood that if we leave, then most likely there will be nothing left. His mother had refused to leave. It's somehow easier together, he said. But he said he went out as little as possible, because they check documents, check phones. If they find something, you can get penned up in the basements. And they have some lists. But, he said that, just sitting at home all the time, waiting, emotionally, you start to go a little crazy, being in some kind of box. Inside Kherson there is little resistance but growing indications of dissent, with slogans spray-painted on walls and roads telling the Russians to leave in strong language. Posters have sprung up warning Russian troops they will have their throats slit at night. Kherson is Ukraine, is another popular slogan, and on Friday the Ukrainian flag was briefly hoisted at the city's railway station. But the Russian-appointed local government is gradually tightening its hold on all aspects of life. Ukrainian goods are disappearing from stores, checkpoints abound. The new rulers talk about federation with Crimea, introducing the ruble and allowing people to have Russian passports. Elena feels a sense of desperation, trapped in Kherson against her will, with no school for her children. I really want to be free, she told CNN. To any city but controlled by Ukraine. Even if the Russians shell it. I'm suffocating here.